don't forget that this course is giving you the core competencies for level 1, and you still need to get some practice, some hands-on to have achieved the clinical competency level at level 1. So that's listed in your handout at around about 20 ultrasound scans on normals and volunteers, or perhaps some of your colleagues in your department, to get to understand machine and normal anatomy, to give you level 1 competency. That's the sort of guidance of the Royal College of Radiologists that will set you in tune with the rest of practice in the country. But it doesn't put you in the same ballpark as the States, where the bar is approximately 10 times as high. Publications from the USA talk about you having to scan at least 200 patients to achieve level 1 competency. Okay? So bear in mind that you will be a very beginner if you've just done 20. Boy, you still need a mentor, you still need somebody to help you to move on in your clinical practice. You must have a mentor if you're going to achieve anything in an ultrasound. Without that, I think you're not going to really take anything into the future. So, just to get going with the ultrasound talk. We're going to basically just overview some of the physics in order to give you a very superficial understanding of how to manipulate the machine. Well, first of all, you have an ultrasound transducer in your hand, and you have a patient, and you have to couple the two together without any air between, and that process is actually facilitated by the use of ultrasound jelly, which makes sure there is no air between the patient and the probe. We're in a very infectious litigant environment. Please, make sure that these probes are properly looked after with covers and with the right spray. They are delicate pieces of equipment. When you drop them, they break, and we have had occasions when that's happened. When you're buying machines, make sure you buy a probe that's capable of superficial and a probe which is capable of deep imaging. You may find that there is a probe which offers both superficial and deep. I doubt it. I doubt whether it'll be successful in both those practices, but you must always bear in mind, you must be visualizing superficial and you must be visualizing deep. Superficial structures require a higher frequency, and deeper structures require a very much lower frequency in order to penetrate through the soft tissues. Bear in mind that if you turn a probe around, then you will turn the orientation of the image around. There is some standardization as to how you hold the probe. The image that's displayed here in a transverse way through the body will always have the right-hand side over here. So the image will have the right-hand side over here. And in a sagittal way, the head end will always be at this side. So there will be a little button, a little piece of plastic on your probe which will tell you the way you should have it orientated, with a little bit of button on the right-hand side or to the head. So that's the normal orientation with probe mark on the actual probe. Some of the basic controls are simply amplification of the actual image to give you brightness. It's called a gain control. And then there are other controls which will control depth of penetration into the body, and also frequency. So penetration, depth and frequency are the three most basic things that you have to get to know very quickly when you're using ultrasound. So just a few reminders about what it is that we should be thinking about in the basics: the frequency, the position of the probe, the use of jelly, and prevention of infection. So this is one of the most simple machines that you could possibly see. We do have some in the department still, and here we have a brightness button which is called the gain control. You can increase the brightness for the near field here in the superficial part of the image, and the brightness for the deeper part of the field here in the more remote parts of the body. That's the gain control. Okay, so that's brightness. There's the actual plastic probe marker, which is always to the right side for a transverse image, and for a sagittal image, that's the head end. That's the normal orientation. Right, what sort of frequencies are we using? Well, we're using megahertz rather than kilohertz. Kilohertz are audible,
Megahertz are not audible, and so we're about 1,000 times what you can hear. And these ultrasound waves are produced by the vibration of a crystal, the same crystal that's in your watch. It's quartz. So there's a whole array of crystals in the probe, and the electrical impedance of that crystal as an electric current travels through it, that crystal vibrates and produces deformity which is actually sound generating. So the vibration of a quartz crystal is what produces the sound, and when the electricity is turned off and the probe is left on the patient's skin, it will pick up reflected sound from the body, and that reflected sound deforms the crystal and forms an electric current in the opposite direction. So you've got electricity going into the probe, sound coming out, turn the probe off, sound coming from the patient back to the probe, electricity formed by the crystal, sound, electricity coming in. And that generation of a current is the sensitivity of the probe. An insensitive probe will not generate much current. And as time goes on, the probe technology improves, the sensitivity of the probe is much better, and the signal to noise, the amount of brightness you get out of your probe versus the amount of grayness in the background, the signal to noise, improves. So that's basically improvement in the manufacturing side of ultrasound. So vibration and a pulse of sound going into the patient, a short packet of sound goes in, and that packet is reflected back. The time it takes for the sound to be reflected back is plotted by the machine as a dot on the image. So something which is far away in the patient takes longer to come back. The machine recognizes that time difference and will plot a dot further in the image, further down. So that's the time from reflection back to the machine is what gives the image the depth of penetration. There's the probe with the crystal, which is vibrating now and producing compression and rarefaction of sound, which gives you a waveform here with a certain wavelength. Now, if that crystal is small, it will vibrate rapidly, and therefore the wavelength will be much shorter. So higher frequency probes use smaller crystals to give you a smaller wavelength. And if you think about that wavelength being very tiny as it goes into the patient, then that tiny wavelength will form very good resolution in the vertical plane. A long wavelength will produce dots further apart. A short wavelength will produce dots very close to each other. So in-plane resolution is determined by frequency. Okay, that's something just to bear in mind. The higher the frequency, the better is the resolution of the image in the vertical plane. Which is why you use high frequency probes for superficial structures. It won't penetrate very well, but you'll get really good detail close to under the skin. Now the other thing to bear in mind always when you're using ultrasound is the fact that clearly a sound wave will be reflected back by a flat surface very nicely, but if you turn and you fire the sound wave at an angle to the flat surface, it will bounce away and not come back. That's called specular reflection. So if you're looking at structures at a right angle to the sound, then you will get very bright echoes. For instance here, the wall of the hepatic vein here is nice and sharp and bright. As the vein turns away from the probe, turns away from a right angle, the edges of that structure become a little bit more difficult to see. So you've got to think about using your probe in different directions to see the structures that you're interested in, because some of the sound will bounce away from you and you will get very poor image quality, whereas others will come back at you very nicely. So you must move the probe around the patient in order to be able to see structures and get the edges of structures in your head quite clearly. So that's specular reflection. The other broad type of reflection is called diffuse reflection or scatter, where you hit a small structure with the sound wave and the sound is more or less explodes off it in different directions. It doesn't just come back to you in a specular wave, but it's transmitted throughout that structure in every direction. That's called a diffuse reflection or scatter. So two types of reflection are which are going to produce the image which you see on the screen. So that's the reflection side of things. This is the frequency of the sound going inside of things, the size of the crystal. The small crystal produces a high frequency, very good for structures close to the skin. But the fact is that the higher the frequency, the poorer is the ability of that ultrasound beam to penetrate deep. So high frequencies will not penetrate; they will be soaked up very quickly by the body. You need a lower frequency to get some decent penetration through the body to be able to see deep structures. So let's just look at a little bit about a probe here. 128 crystals are arrayed along this linear probe here. It occupies some distance, and that distance will give you a good window of anatomy for superficial structures. A small probe placed on the body surface will not give you much detail of the superficial area, but as it fans out, will give you lots of detail of the deeper structures. So it's a fact that you need a relatively long probe for superficial imaging, and you can get away with a relatively small probe for deep imaging because of the sector nature of the beam that comes out of it. It has a finite width, that beam, and if you think about that, for instance, if you're using a probe that produces a beam the width of your fingers and you put a little needle in it, you may find that you don't see the needle very well because it's only a tiny little structure within a wide beam. You would have to think about organising your probe in order to see that needle at right angles to get a good image of it. So tiny little structures which are present within a relatively wide beam will not be seen very well unless you start to think about angling the probe. This is a very basic diagram of crystals which have a backing substance. That backing substance will allow multi-frequency use of modern probes. Modern probes will have an electrical way of holding onto the crystals so that you can generate different frequencies from the crystals. It's the backing substance which is important in holding the crystal in a certain way that allows those multi-frequencies to be produced by one probe. That's more or less modernisation of probe technology that's happening now. So the basic principle from this slide is to say that the size of the crystal is proportional to the wavelength that comes out of it, and the smaller wavelengths are associated with high frequency probes and better resolution in the vertical plane. If we were to look at the image that's produced on your screen, you will see that the image is produced in a raster fashion, in that there is a series of pulses that come across the probe like this, and the reflections that come up from the different times, depth and distance along the image are built up in a format that looks like this, but so fast you can't really appreciate it to the eye, unless the screen refresh rate, the judder effect on the screen, is so slow that you can see movement of the image very slowly like this if you have lots and lots of software activated at the same time. So the frame rate refresh is something that you've got to be considering in order to allow you to move the probe without judder on the patient's skin. So refreshing the frame rate on the actual screen is an important thing to consider when you're actually moving the probe around the patient. If you have too many functions on, the machine will take so much time to plot the image that it will be relatively juddery. So multiple functions and moving the probe sometimes results in a juddery image on the screen. So that's another thing to consider apart from your choice of probe, your depth, your frequency, your amplification, your gain. It's starting now to build in your head. It's starting to get complicated now. But those are the basic things that you have to have in the front of your mind when you're actually using the machine. So I talked a little bit about the different probes that we generally use. These linear probes are very good for superficial structures. Curvy linear probes will get between ribs and are very good for deep structures. Using electronic steering of the beam will help to take a flat transducer and fan out the beam, electronically steering the beam rather than mechanically steering the beam. That's more modern technology. Here we have a basic ultrasound machine which is producing sound. These pulsars are the part of the machine that produce vibration of the crystal that produces sound waves that go into the patient. Here you see a work called focus. Now, there is a finite width to that beam. We looked at that earlier on. If we can focus that beam in some way, we will increase the lateral resolution. We've talked about the vertical resolution, which is frequency dependent. Now the lateral resolution in the sideways plane can be improved by using a focus function on the machine. And you'll see a little triangle at the side of the image on most ultrasound machines that tells you where you've put your focus, and you can change the depth of that focus. Where you can place the focus in the region of interest, the area that you want to really look at in detail. So that's actually bringing the lateral sides of the beams together so that the lateral resolution is improved. Having done that, we can produce some sound that is reflected back, and by adding together some of the line information, we can improve the image quality and the digitization of the beam, and then amplify the beam, make it brighter, use black and whiteness or compression to improve the contrast of the image on the screen, and then perhaps take some smoothing of the edges of dots and bring them together if you want to look at the inside of a homogeneous structure, like for instance the liver or consolidated lung. So other things that you'll need to read a bit more about, and there is some information in your pack that gives the definitions of these terms in a little bit more detail. Like the compression is basically black and whiteness or contrast, and pre-processing is smoothing of the image. Rather than giving you a very sharp dot, you give a relatively smooth dot that merges together and gives you good soft tissue detail. Those sort of things are generally set for you when you press the button to start for chest, and you press a button for abdomen, and it will give you a different setup that will optimize the setup for that particular part of the anatomy. So you don't really need to get to worry about that too much, but just be aware that there are things like compression and pre-processing that will allow you to have a better image quality, and that comes with the button when you press it for a particular function like chest ultrasound. After the image is produced into your memory, just like with a camera image, you can do something with that camera image. You can magnify it up, and you can do some distance measurement on it, and then save it to an archive. And this archive thing is really important. This saving the image to packs or paper or film is very important, because if you're using this to scan a patient, you have to save the evidence that you used as your diagnosis. You must have some way of recording how you took the scan and made it into a judgment clinically. And the best way to do that is to take an image, hold it, and then write a report with the image. That image illustrates what you want, the point you want to make in the report. And the best way of doing that is to attach your ultrasound machine to a PACS environment in a normal radiology department, for instance. You plug your machine in and you download the images. They're downloaded to a box in PACS, and that box has a text file attached to it where you can type in your report. If you can't manage that in your hospital, then the least you should do is to take a paper image, a thermal image from the machine, press a button, there's a little thermal camera attached to it, and then stick it in the notes and write down your interpretation of that scan. If you don't do that, if you just sort of muddle along, you're bound to trip over a patient at some stage and not be able to justify what you've done, and you will be judged to be practicing outside your scope of practice. And that will put you in a negligent situation, in my view. Anu will talk a bit about the legal side of it later on this afternoon, the legal and governance issues, and sort of highlight that a little bit more to make you understand how important it is. This is just basically to illustrate what focus is. The beam has a certain width. You can actually bring the beam to a focus by slowing down some of the electrical current that comes to the middle crystals here. By slowing that down, you bring the wavefronts together, just as you would with pebbles in a lake. If you drop a series of pebbles down, you'll see a wavefront. If you curve those pebbles, you'll see the wavefront will converge. Quite interesting, no? But that's basically using resistors within electrical circuits to slow down the arrival of an electrical current to a crystal, which will then delay the wavefront and focus the actual overall beam and give you better lateral resolution. Now the raw information that comes back from the patient, the sound that is then hits the crystals, as the crystals are deformed and produce an electrical current, this is the raw electrical current that comes back. Here at depth, you can see that the signal is very weak, very quiet at depth, so you would expect the image to be relatively difficult to see at depth. And what we need to do is to magnify that those signals with the gain control, the far gain control, the distance gain control, and then modulate that with a computer. Instead of producing a sine wave here, we produce here an amplitude wave of the strength of the signal at those depths. Amplitude mode, that is called. And that amplitude brightness becomes brightness on screen. So amplitude is the strength of the signal electrically. That electrical signal is then produces brightness on the screen, brightness mode. So if you look at that, that's the history of ultrasound through the years, is taking the electrical signal, producing an amplitude mode. There was, at the beginning, only a line on the screen, there was no image, and then that line on the screen, somebody thought, well, let's make that line on the screen into a brightness on the screen, and then they made it B mode. And then from B mode they would then move into black and white image mode, and then from that into movement mode, which is colour mode, and duplex imaging, and all sorts from there. So that's basically an illustration of the history of the development of ultrasound. So we've looked at that image before, we know a little bit about that. This is the effects of increasing the black and whiteness of the image, the dynamic range. By having a narrow dynamic range, the grayscale is very narrow, and therefore it's very black and white. So the compression of the dynamic range will produce a very black and white image, and will give you good edge detail at the sides of structures, but it doesn't give you a very good internal detail of the parenchyma of the structure you're looking at, which occurs when you widen the dynamic range and make it more of a grayscale. So I'm not going to labour the scan converter, which is basically a computer that takes digital information and presents it to you in a readable fashion. But I think it's important that you do understand a little bit about pixels. Those of you that have digital cameras will know straight away that pictures are made out of squares digitally, and that if you have an image which is made out of big squares, it's very pixely and squarey, and if you magnify it up, all you've got is squares. So the strength of the archive in your computer is basically dependent on how much computing power you have, how much RAM, for instance, and whether you're able to then produce an image which has very small pixels. And those pixels, the depth of the pixels, the actual bit depth, is the dynamic range. So if you have a tiny little dot, and the dots are represented with a very wide grayscale, you will have an image which is very pleasing to the eye. So that's basically just a copy of camera technology, of what you understand by camera memory. Archive, remember, risk governance. So when you pick up a machine, when you go to the machine this morning, for instance, you'll be thinking, goodness me, right, tell me what this transducer is and how I select the transducer. How do I alter the frequency and end up with something superficial versus deep? Where's the button to improve the lateral resolution at a certain depth, the focus button, for instance? Output power will be out of your hands. It will be in the manufacturer already, so that you don't actually fry the patient. This is energy going in. One of the major principles for radiology is ALAR, principle as low as reasonably achieved. So we use as little energy into patients as is possible to achieve the purpose, which is an image. For radiation protection, it's crucial and it's legal. For ultrasound, it isn't so crucial and it isn't legal, but you need to be aware that if you damage a patient, for instance a fetus, by over-irradiating the sound and using power which is too high, you might just cook a piece of embryonic tissue. That's the sort of ballpark that you can get into if you're using an old machine, for instance, and you have the power output to its maximum, and then you use Doppler on top of it. It's not just thermal energy, the thermal index that we need to talk about in safety terms, but it's also the mechanical energy, the mechanical index. There are these indices the industry uses to show you how safe you are using your machine. mechanical index is producing, if you put a sound beam into a patient and you produce cavitation, then what you do is you explode a bubble of gas within tissue, which then collapses very quickly, and on collapse the deformity of tissues is really quite severe, and you can actually damage tissue if you have an inappropriately set up machine. It's never going to happen in your department, I don't think, but you need to be aware that you need to understand that there are things that are safety, which are mechanical and thermal in the machine, mechanical index, thermal index, which will be set for you by the manufacturer. Some machines have sliders that will allow the gain to be improved, the brightness to be improved at certain specific depths. Just a little set of little sliders that you'll see. That's just another brightness control. It's called a time gain control. You'll see those on some machines. Compression we've talked about, that's black and whiteness. Pre-processing for smoothing the edges of dots is again pre-processing, and sharpness is the same sort of thing. All those things are given to you free when you press the button. Compound imaging is not something we'll go into in any great depth, but we'll talk about its use particularly in needle visualization, and harmonic imaging is something that does help in improving image quality. We'll talk about that as well. So, harmonic imaging. If you were to pass sound into the body, that sound produces deformity of structures, and there is a reflection of sound coming out, and the reflection of sound is the principal frequency, but also the harmonics of that frequency. And the harmonics do not have the artifact that the principal frequency has. So what we'll see is that with structures like liquid, the internal structure of the liquid is better represented when you press the harmonics button here, because the artifacts that are produced in the near field by reverberation between these interfaces, those artifacts are actually presented into the image here as sort of greyness. Those artifacts produced by the primary frequency in don't exist when the harmonic is generated from within the tissues and is coming out of the body. So the harmonic frequency, although it's a very quiet and it lacks amplitude, that harmonic frequency is generated by the primary frequency inside the body and is coming out of the body, and it doesn't have the artifact that's associated with the production of the sound as it goes into the patient. So you get a better contrast within liquid especially, and that's particularly useful for you when you're looking at pleural fluid and the edges of pleural fluid and the edges of lung coming up to the pleural fluid, if you want to distinguish consolidated lung from an effusion, so that you know it's safe to put a needle into the fluid and you're not going to hit the lung. So that's to be recommended, harmonic imaging, when you are looking at fluid. Compound imaging steers the sound wave not just in a straight direction, it steers it to the side, and it allows you to get better spectral reflection from something like a needle. So compound imaging is particularly important when you're doing practical procedures. Harmonic imaging is particularly helpful when you're looking for the edges of fluid. Doppler. Doppler is taking sound onto moving structures and getting a reflection back, just as you would expect with a speed camera. As a car moves towards the speed camera, then the frequency that's fired out and returned to the speed camera is increased. The frequency is increased. The pitch is higher for the reflected sound as the structure moves towards the camera. The difference in the sound out and the sound returned is called the Doppler shift, and that Doppler shift, the difference in frequencies, is plotted as sound as an image with colour in colour Doppler, or as a waveform with spectral Doppler. So flowing blood, it clearly very important for you to understand if you are looking at an artery, intercostal arteries and arteries within the lung. If you were to do a practical procedure again, I want to stay away from arteries when I put a needle in, and so you will need to have some understanding of how you would use Doppler to produce images of moving blood. It's important to understand that if you are looking at a blood vessel with Doppler, that you will get no colour in the moving structure if you're looking at it at right angles. And you must look along the length of a vessel in order to get a decent colour fill, because at right angles there is no colour fill at all. Here, for instance, pleural fluid and consolidated lung, very difficult to see which is which on that particular image, but if you put the colour button on, you will see that you're dealing here with consolidated lung, pulmonary artery, and not just simply an exudate. Intercostal artery, avoiding a punch biopsy of the artery there with that. Your ultrasound machine always thinks about straight lines. It will not understand anything that is reflected off the straight axis. So if your machine produces sound that spreads from the probe off the normal beam, it will be received back, and the machine will produce it because it's in the beam. That's straight line reflection assumption, which is something that all ultrasound machines use. The actual dot is produced at a certain depth according to how long it takes for the reflected sound to arrive. All machines will presume that it takes a certain time to be reflected back, and the image will be plotted according to the time that's taken to reflect back. And because of those assumptions, the machine will actually produce some artifacts that you'll need to be aware of in order to prevent you misdiagnosing. Reverberation artifact is the commonest artifact here, where there's a very bright structure which is reflected backwards and forwards between the bright structure and the probe, and gives you multiple lines within the image. Reverberation artifact. That's the most common artifact that you will see, reverberation artifact. When that reverberation artifact is really produced by a tiny little structure like a bubble of liquid within the surface of the lung, it will produce these comet tail artifacts here. And those are things that are very helpful when you want to know, am I looking at lung or am I looking at pneumothorax, because there will be no liquid producing these artifacts in pneumothorax. So to distinguish air within lung from air within pneumothorax, you want to be looking at comet tail artifact. Sound moves travels through some structures at a different velocity, and through, for instance, things like fat, it travels very slowly through fat compared to, for instance, liver, and because of that, it takes longer for the specular reflection from the diaphragm to be returned to the probe as it's passed through fat, and the machine plots the actual diaphragm at a depth which is unreal. It's very deep. It's not there at all. It's an artifact produced by the transmission of sound through a slow conducting structure like fat, so that things like refraction artifact as a result of differences in the speed of sound through different tissues are another artifact that you need to be sometimes aware of. Here, off-beam location projected within the actual structure. The little bright bubble of gas is projected within the gallbladder because of these side lobes returning the sound, and it being considered by the machine to be in the middle of the sound beam. That's side lobe artifact. And mirror image artifact here, where the strength of the reflected sound is so great from the edges of the cyst that the reverberation backwards and forwards here produces a structure which doesn't exist above the diaphragm. That's a very common artifact when you're looking at the diaphragm. Some structures that are below the diaphragm will be presented to you on the screen as if they are above the diaphragm. These mirror image artifacts are very, very common if you're getting a very bright diaphragmatic reflection. That's a good example there of a double bladder. There's the real bladder and there's the pretend bladder, produced because of that bright reflection there, that specular reflection. And the same here for a tumour within a structure. It's actually a bladder tumour, can be presented outside of the structure. That's just not real. That is just an artifact. Okay, be aware that bones reflect sound very well. That can help you when you're looking for things like ribs. That's the last real artifact that you just need to give some thought to.